very specifically about what are the foundations of human systems dynamics. There are some ways in which human systems dynamics is not complexity science, but it is so deeply grounded in complexity science that what we've done is to begin with the fertile ground of many different complexity sciences and to grow from that a praxis of action in human systems. And so I want to begin, because you have the theoretical foundations, I'd like to begin there. Questions about that would be really lovely. I spend most of my time speaking with practitioners who are wrestling desperately with complex questions, and they're not so interested in the philosophy. So one of the reasons I'm really pleased to be with you is to hear those questions. My background is in history and philosophy of science at a great books program. Those of you who are familiar with Santa Fe, it's called St. John's College. And so my background was reading classical texts and talking about them and figuring them out. I wrote my senior essay on a passage from Galileo, Two New Sciences, figuring out what infinity was. And then about 10 years later, after I had bumped into complexity, trying to solve business problems, I was an entrepreneur, I had an opportunity to hear Eoyang speak. And I was sitting in the front row, very excited to hear what he had to say. And he took out his first slide. It was back in the old days of overhead projectors. And it was the quote I'd written my essay on when I was 23, from Galileo. Struggling with what it means to think about something that we can only imagine, and how do we come to build a science about something that we can't really see. And so it's that place where I've spent my life, not just trying to understand it, but also trying to make it useful. So we look for what's both true and useful. And so what I want to share with you is some of those foundations, and I hope that there's so many different directions that we might go. I want to make sure that we go paths for your questions. The second thing I want to do is to talk about what's the discipline of HSD. So human systems dynamics is a discipline for problem solving and addressing patterns rather than problems. So we often talk about finite games where there are bounds and clear measures and interdependencies that are clear, bounded, low dimension, linear systems. Those are problems that can be solved. On the other extreme are issues that are open and high dimension and nonlinear, the ones that you all love and dive into, that we call patterns, not problems. And so we've developed a discipline, we hope very accessible discipline, for working with patterns. And I'd like to talk with you briefly about what that discipline is. And finally, about what the praxis is, that when we bring the theory base and the practice together at that intersection of exploration, where we currently are in our research, what the praxis is. So that's the plan for, we have 6 hours, right?
Yeah.
We'll see. So what are the foundations of HSD? So we're going to look at complex systems. We're going to look at 3 parts of the foundation. What is a system? And you all know there are lots of ways to define system. There's one particular way that we have chosen because we find that it's a best fit to understanding human systems. The second thing we're going to do is to talk about how we think about change. So Perbach's work on self-organized criticality has really built our understanding for what change is. And so we have a fairly simple way to talk about self-organized criticality that is meaningful to business people who are dealing with change. We'll also talk about what we see as influencing change. So if systems are self-organizing, what are the conditions that determine how quickly, how clearly, how directly systems self-organize? That was the research that I did for my doctorate. And then we'll talk a bit about what action looks like there, adaptive action. So as foundations. We're going to start with what's a system. Now, first I'm going to say that when I began to work in complexity and look for ideas, there were 2 things I wanted. I wanted coherence in the meaning making, and I wanted useful action. And given that I couldn't find the first, I went to the second. But we drew in our practice ideas and perspectives from many different sciences. And so you'll find that the ways that we think and talk about complexity have chosen what are the most pragmatic pieces, or pieces that we found were self-similar across the fields. So essentially, when I came up with the conditions for self-organizing, I dove as deeply as I could into each of these fields, looking for what was the same across them, thinking that that would be a lever that we could use in practice. So those are the conditions. This gives you a sense of the breadth of the sources that we use. Okay. So when we talk about systems, we talk about complex adaptive systems. Many of you know this. In fact, I suppose all of you do. They're agents, they're relatively free to act in unpredictable ways, they interact and they generate patterns over time. And those patterns, once they begin to be established, influence the behaviors of the agents in future states. So we have the upward causality and the downward causality of the system that is reinforcing itself. We also know that these complex adaptive systems are multi-leveled. So each of the agents is itself a complex adaptive system, and these patterns participate in a larger scale of complex adaptive systems. Does that make sense? And I'll be really curious about how it's same as and different from the way you think of complexity. We find this a very accessible definition for people because they can say, yeah, I was on a team once that came together in a really high-performing way, and once we did, it perpetuated over time. Or they say, oh, I see my family here, or they see my organization or my industry. We often talk about conflict, about the process of learning, and so this same process of change we use in many, many different levels and contexts. Any questions about this just as the choice of a definition of system that we made early in the process? Any questions or comments about that? By the way, we often draw on other systems disciplines, and I'll show you why and how in a bit. So that's what we think a system is. When we talk about change in a complex system, we like to think about three kinds of change. One is static change, and that's like, this is here, I'll put it there, end of story. It's a balance of forces, it's a shift of an object in a singular direction. Those of you who studied 9th grade science know statics. The challenge is that many people who work in organizational and human systems change think it's like that. I get a new employee, I'm going to pass them through a new employee orientation, and then they'll be ready to work. I have a bad performing employee, I'll send them to training, and they'll be fine. And our assumption about human systems change is that it is static in that way. A to B, if the system doesn't go, it's because it's resisting that kind of a change. And I find that when I began this work, about 90% of the organization change and human systems change literature was stuck there. Bit by bit, they began to grow into the second kind of change, which is, we call it dynamic. Essentially, it's Newtonian change, where you know enough at the beginning of the system that you can predict its path and its ending point at any point of time in the future. So it gives you a sense of a through passage and an end point and all the things in between. It too is very useful. I know a lot of my complexity colleagues love to disrespect Newton, and I don't. I guess it's because I spent too long in his passage in the history of philosophy science. But think about the things that we think about in social change that are dynamic. I'm a project manager. I make a project plan. I start that plan in motion, and I assume that on Tuesday of next week I can tell you where the team will be, and I tell my funder that by the end of the quarter I know where I'll be. But we also know that change doesn't really work that way. And good project managers have learned how to live in that space. It's kind of a manifold rather than a project plan, and they found a way to move in it. But they do that intuitively. They can't talk about it. And so many of my early students came to me to say, I know it doesn't work like that, but I still have to take real practical action in the world, and I know how to do it. I know that what I do is right, but I don't know how to talk about it, so I can't help anybody else do it. And I can't bring a team along with me. And so many of them use HSD to capture their intuitions about what really works in the real world. Because they've got the practice, they don't have the theory, and this gives a theory for them to hold on to. Does that make sense? And so enters the third kind of change. And the third kind of change is dynamical change. There are many different ways to talk about dynamical change. Our favorite comes from Perbach, self-organized criticality. That if static change is like moving something from A to B, and dynamic change is like throwing something, dynamical change is like an avalanche. So the system is sitting there, looks stable, looks still, many different layers and levels. But we know that inside, at levels that we can't see, there are things that are changing. The water's melting and freezing, there are little animals running around. Inside, there are changes happening that are destabilizing the level that we're looking at. At the same time, there are changes outside in the larger system that are also putting stress on the structure. And there's some point where it begins to loosen and break. Just a little bit, and then a little bit more. And then a little bit more and a little bit more until it collapses. So the sand pile, right? So all of you know about Perbach's work and what that looks like. I cannot tell you how much sense that makes to business people. They say, yeah, that is the way change happens. And you can talk about it in terms of learning. This is the way people learn. You really don't learn A, B, C. You learn building the tension, building the tension, building the tension until it breaks through into an awe. In fact, some of our associates are looking at what they're calling a deep learning ecology, to think about what it really means to have a pedagogy, which is doing this. And a pedagogy is setting conditions for that kind of dynamical transformation. And those of you who teach know those moments when that transformation happens. We also use it with conflict. So much of the work that we do is with conflict in small groups and large groups and at national levels, like Washington, D.C. So Donald Trump didn't come from nowhere. It was not a, first we were A and then we were B. And it was not a dynamic process, even though there are lots of us conspiracy theorists who say somebody had a plan and he's the end of the line. No. We as a culture have been changing at multiple scales and multiple times in multiple ways, and the tension has emerged until it broke through with that election. And we continue then to have cascade after cascade coming through. And so it's a way in which that kind of change, which is technically incredibly complex and a major paradigm shift for thought, suddenly becomes familiar to them from their experiences with their 2-year-olds and their clients and their own emotional transitions. And I'm sure you also make it really clear that all dynamical change is not bad dynamical change. Falling in love is also a dynamical change. So what are your thoughts, comments, questions about this kind of simplistic but accessible way to talk about the work? And my goal is always to be true, if not complete, in talking about complexity. So be looking at the places where it's not true based on what you know, but I promise you it's not complete.
There's some sort of linkage there to, I'm not an academic, by the way, I'm a practitioner, but to some of the Gestalt work around resistances to change, which talks about 3 levels, which is the first one being the problem with change is simply one of information, and if we give more information, people will understand. The second one is more of an emotional resistance to change, which is people's fears and those kinds of more, but again, don't really have the tools to talk about it when you're dealing with change in systems, so they often go back to questioning the information instead of that. And then the third one is more an interpersonal one, so it is dynamical in that sense, to use that word, or dynamic, but it's more about, I suppose, deeper levels of trust, likability, at oneness, whatever.
And it's interesting, we have lots of people who practice Gestalt and other kinds of psychology, and the way they would describe this is, yes, there are 3 different kinds of tension in an individual that would promote change.
Okay.
And so tension, that difference, is what holds the potential energy in the system, pretty literally, we think. So my information, what I know, what I don't know, is a difference that would generate tension that might be strong enough to bring an avalanche. My emotional distinctions may be enough to bring an avalanche that difference may hold enough potential. And if that doesn't work, maybe the social matrix in which I stand holds enough difference that will accumulate enough energy to motivate a change.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So we would think about it in that way, and the idea of tension coming from difference, bringing on change, means that we can transcend physical and non-physical systems very easily. So there's no difference in the mind and the body. Doing acupuncture is the same thing. How do I find a point in the body where there's a tension, where releasing it will cause a movement in there? So these principles are ones that transcend medium. Does that make sense? May sound a little strange. But you can go back to every psychological discipline and think about it in this way as well. So even Freud we have lots of people who study Jung. In fact, there's a group in the US that's called the Society for Chaos Theory in Psychology and the Life Science. It's a very interesting group. It's been around for 20 years. And they look at all different applications. Thank you. Anything else about where you see dynamical change? Yes, ma'am?
I think bouncing off. There's an interesting corollary as well with Dave Snowden's work and Kinevin framework. Yeah, so just it resonates.
It does, in fact, and Dave and I have talked about this a lot, that in fact, and it kind of fits and it kind of doesn't fit. Because you
No, it's not, it's corollary, yeah, it's not fitting, yeah.
It's
mirror.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that became really clear to me. Back in the late 80s, when I first started doing this work, there were just a few of us, and we were talking about it in very different ways. But we didn't feel like we needed to have a same way. The way we talked about it then was, we're all describing something that has never been described before. And we are creating whatever language comes out of our history, fits with our social groups, fits with our experience, fits with our practice, to describe whatever that is. And so it's almost like multiple poems written about love. Does any of them ever really capture it? No. But sometimes you want a haiku, and sometimes you want grapes of wrath. Is that about love? Maybe not. Anyway, so each of those pathways is a perfectly valid pathway. They may never agree with each other, but they're maps of the system that can be useful. And so Dave and I have had a lot of conversation, pro and con, about the ways that he looks at the system and the ways that I do, and what the strengths of each are. And I often will bring clients to SenseMaker. Very important. I'll often begin them with the Kinefin, but I find that it brings up some misconceptions that are hard to get past when you get a little bit farther down the road. Yeah. Dave doesn't believe that, but you can imagine. So, and he's not shy about it.
No, Dave is Dave.
Yeah, that's right. So, so this whole idea about how we describe what it is. In fact, some of you may know Jack Cohen, who wrote The Collapse of Chaos. He worked with Ian Stewart early in complexity work. He was a reproductive biologist, and Ian Stewart was a mathematician. And they had worked together early to try to come up with a language to describe complexity that would be robust from their two perspectives. And he called me up one day, and he said, we can't do it. We've decided he and I can't get a picture of it. But he said, I've got this friend from the RAND Corporation who's a massive AI guy, and you've got the human systems, and I've got the biological systems. Let's get together and see if we can name it. And so we spent a fabulous 3 days trying to meld the conversations of algorithm and pattern and taxonomy, because that's really kind of the roots of his biology, and to come up with something, and it didn't work. It didn't work. Otherwise, you would have heard about it, surely. But we learned a lot in the process, because what we saw was that the differences among the ways that we looked at the work generated new insights for all of us. It didn't lead to a great synergy in the sky. It didn't lead to a great synergy, but the tension there fed back into each of our practices to make them richer. And that's what I think about transdisciplinary practice, is that that's what we're about. Not creating one thing, which is transing all our disciplines, but that if I meet you in this transdisciplinary space, then when we part, we take back something that's much richer than we would have come with before. It's been my experience. Now, it's nice if you can create one trends across your disciplines. It just doesn't happen often. So that's what we think about change. Now, thinking about change in that way and wanting to be able to influence it. Now, one of my frustrations really early in complexity was that the descriptions were great retrospectively. That we could look in the past and say, yes, that has such a Lyapunov number, and it's this kind of an attractor, and this has that. That it was all retrospective analysis. And I was running a business. I needed to make decisions. I could not spend as much as I wanted to be an academic and think looking back. I had to be looking forward. So my question was, and I knew that we couldn't predict or control. So how do you think about a future that you don't predict and control? That was the question that drove me into a doctorate. And the question was, what can I know about the system in this moment that will tell me about what its potential is for moment next, so that I can influence it in this spot? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that was what drove me. And that was when I went into all these different sciences, understanding as much as I could. And I was smarter then, so I could read farther into those books than I could read now. But seeing what it was, how did they define the systems they were looking at? How did they work on them? What choices did they make? And I realized that there were three conditions that influenced the speed and the path and the direction of self-organizing systems in all of those different fields. And that's what I call the CDE model. And this says there are three conditions. The first is that a system, in order to self-organize, has to have some kind of thing that contains it. The agents have got to be more likely to bump into each other than not. Does that make sense? So the degrees of freedom in terms of movement have to be controlled so that they'll interact. A really small container makes the system move quickly and in a predictable way. A large container makes it wander around and get lost. That's the first condition. Now please think about the ways that you know of thinking about complexity science and see what you use or think about as the containing feature. Sometimes the container is not a boundary like a fence. Sometimes it's a central point of attraction, not an attractor, but a central point. So there's some ways in which I'm a container for us. There's some ways in which you're a container for us. There's some ways in which this discussion process, the Anthropocene, is a container for us. And there are, in any system, there are an infinite number, there's an uncountable number of containers that are present at all the times. And what you do, as you're engaging with it, is to select the one that's most important or most significant, most relevant to what you're looking at that moment. That doesn't mean the others go away. It doesn't mean you're not even influenced by them, but you choose which one is your point of focus. And then you zoom out, and then you zoom in. So that's container, number one. They can be permeable or impermeable. Container. The second is difference. That a complex system is not going to self-organize if everything is the same. Full stop. That's high entropy, nothing's going to happen, there's no energy in the system, it's lost. And if there's too much difference, the system is running around and can't settle into anything because every time it almost does, it gets torn up again, right? And that is the random end where it isn't self-organizing. Does that make sense? And so you have that end where it's not organized enough, and you have this end where it's too organized. And so we're looking for the right number of significant differences that make a difference. So for example, when I'm working in a community and bringing a community together for dialogue, one of the first things I have to do is to decide what are the differences that are going to make a difference to us in that conversation in that day. Be very explicit about it. That I can value other things as they come up, but I can put them on the bike rack and wait for later. But to be able to say, this conversation is focusing on this difference. Because if there are too many, well, you've been in that meeting where nothing really happens. And you've also been in the other meeting where nothing really happens because it's so tightly controlled and where everybody is the same and you're just hearing them say the same things to each other. In fact, I was thinking this afternoon as we were talking about academic conferences and opportunities in academic conferences. I've been in some where everybody thought so much alike that the only differences were really trivial ones. You've been there too. You were at that same meeting. And you've also been at ones where there's so many ideas and so much richness that you can't handle the whole thing. You find one person you know, or one person where the difference is amenable between you, navigable, and then you build around that. So that's what difference is. That makes sense? Now, it can be any kind of dimension. Anything can hold the difference. It can be race, it can be experience, it can be history, it can be distance, it can be political structures, it can be any differentiating factor can function as a source of energy in these systems. That's what D is. So think about your favorite complexity approach and think, what are the differences that get privileged in that way of approaching your systems? And third is E, exchange. Then it doesn't matter how much difference there is, but if we're not exchanging, then nothing's going to happen. And the exchanges can be very tight and controlling and linear. Like if I take hold of your arm, right? That's a connection that would be very strong and linear. I could predict what would happen if I had a tight connection like that. Or it may be very loose. It may even be totally uncoupled, so that you're an agent in the system and I'm not even in touch with you, but you're in touch with her and she's in touch with her and she's in touch with me. And then there's a way in which those feedback loops get worked. Does that make sense? And if they're very tight, the system is predictable. If you have very few differences, the system is predictable. And you have very small containers, the system is predictable. And as the container gets larger, and as the differences increase, and as the exchanges loosen, the system becomes less and less knowable, passing through a kind of patterned, coherent stage, and then off at some point into a random one. And so the transition from one to another can be very smooth, and the characteristics are entangled. So it's, they're interdependent. So if you change the container, the differences shift, the exchanges shift. You can see how that relationship would work. But they are independent, they're interdependent. Questions, comments about the CDE? I believe that's all there is. That there isn't anything else. That every change that happens, every level of existence, social, intellectual, physical, at all levels, I believe that's all there is. Now, I don't say that to a group of banking CEOs who've come together and are trying to figure out how to change their cultures. But at a really fundamental place, I think that this is the driver for the way that we know things through what are the containers, differences, and exchanges. It's also the way we influence things, because if this is what a system is, and I want to change the system, what do I change? Make the containers bigger or smaller. Increase or decrease the number of relevant differences. Tighten or loosen the exchanges. That's it. Those are your only choices for intervention. Now, there are a million ways you can do any one of those things. So it's not easy, but it is simple. I can't wait for your questions. Let's go. Okay, so adaptive action. So then the question is, if this is the way change is happening, and I'm a conscious human being, and I can't push on the system, then what can I do to make a difference? How can I influence? And this is where we come with adaptive action. What? What are the patterns? What are the tensions? What's happening in the system? What does research say? What do other things say? By the way, I'm happy to send these slides to you. We have a totally open intellectual property policy. Anything that you learn from us, you're welcome to use. And anyway, 2 requests. One is that you cite the source so people can find more. I don't need to say that to academics. I do have to say that to business people. And the second one is that once you use it and learn from it or use it for a paper, that you feed it back. So I'm getting a copy of your dissertation, right? Because the point is to feed these ideas into what might be a positive future. So what are the current patterns? What do you see? What are the similarities, differences? What are the containers, differences, and exchanges at this point? What do you observe? What's the research? What have others reserved? So there's a long list of questions. You have your own questions that you might ask. Essentially, they're data collection. And I don't pretend to have invented these 3 questions, but we found them quite useful. So what is the first one? So what is the second question? This is the analysis question. So what are the effects of the current conditions? If you look at the current conditions, what effect is that having? What are the tensions that have built up in that system that might have the potential for a change that we envision or desire? What's important? Because at that moment, you're going to see lots of containers, lots of differences, lots of exchanges, lots of opportunities, and you need to ask yourself, in the context of community or in the context of learning or whatever context you're in, what's relevant? What is fit for function at that time and place? That's part of the so what question, because you have to choose. What options do you have? What does success look like? How are you going to measure it? So what? By the way, these are the questions why it's so important that we learn in community. And why it's so exciting to be here on this campus is because you cannot answer these questions by yourself. You can only do it really in community. To stand in inquiry the way you need to stand in inquiry, it's a social process of meaning making that's implied. Then now what? That's the pragmatist in me that says you can what and so what as long as you want to, but there's got to be, at the end of the day, a now what. And I'm feeling that urgency more and more in these days as the political and social and environmental world is getting to the place where it needs to be, that the now what becomes quite critical for us to move forward. And so now what are you going to do to shift the similarities and differences and connections? How are you going to communicate? And what's next? And then immediately upon action, what's the next stage? Because that system's going to shift. No matter what you do, the system will shift, and so you then have to, in a way you can't predict. And you say, what do you need to do next? What, so what, now what?
Sorry, in that previous slide,
Yeah.
sorry, just one back one.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the effects of the conditions. When you refer to conditions, are you talking about those 3 variables?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah. And when I talk about similarities, differences, and connections, let me go to this one. I found that the language, containers, differences, and exchanges was much too abstract for most people. So I tried to find a way to label them that was more accessible.
Okay.
And that's what I came up with, was similarities or containers. It's what hold the system together. Differences, there's nothing simpler than saying differences.
Okay.
And connections are the way that people think about relationships. So people who do evaluation, systems evaluation, have a particular set, language that they use for the CDE. They talk about boundaries and perspectives and relationships. So if you've seen that definition of systems of program evaluation, it's based on this. They've simply chosen the language that's relevant in their places for it. Other questions, comments? I do want to talk a little bit about, this was an exercise we were going to do. Let's do. So this is just a really quick exercise to practice adaptive action and see the ways in which the patterns shift. So if you pick a partner, please. This will only take about maybe 6 minutes. I think it'll be a good investment in 6 minutes. So pick a partner in the room. And does everybody have something to write with and a piece of paper? And take a piece of paper, something to write with. Yeah, you can come over here. So everybody has their equipment that they need?
Yeah.
How to overcome suicide problems.
So what I'd like for you to do is to think of a very sticky issue.
You've got to have a sticky issue.
Think of an issue. Think of an issue that's very sticky. Something that something close to you would probably be better than something far away. We've done this with things like sustainability and world peace, but I invite you to think about a spousal tension today instead, right, which may also be intractable. So think about a challenge that you have right now. Maybe something that keeps you awake at night. You've tried to solve it. It doesn't stay solved. It is a real irritation. Think of one. And write 3 sentences about it on your paper. 3 sentences.
Change it from change.
Write 3 sentences.
As questions or just
Any questions, any statements, any observations? So 3 sentences. Write your 3 sentences in silence if you can. 3 sentences.
I'm teaching community development.
I'll give you another minute.
Well, I mean, of course, we all our context today, and then we'll talk about
Does anybody need more time? 3 sentences. Anybody need more time, or shall I ring the bell? Awesome. So this, yes, it is. So that's your what. Now, simply by doing that step, you have distilled your messy, intractable problem in some way. You've named particular containers for it when you've given it nouns. You've named certain verbs for it, for the exchanges. You've named certain differences that make a difference just in those 3 sentences. Now, is it a complete description? No. But is it a true description? Maybe. We're going to find out in just a minute, right? But you have now done a model of your sticky issue in these 3 things. Now, what I want you to do is to read the 3 sentences to your partner. So you'll read your 3 sentences, and no fair giving any other stories.
Okay.
Just the 3 sentences. And the reason is that these sticky issues, we have narratives about those sticky issues. In fact, we fall in love with our narratives about the sticky issues so that we can't even see the sticky issue anymore. So don't tell all the story and all the history. Just read the 3 sentences. And then your partner is going to ask you questions, which you will not answer. So you're just going to listen to the questions. Are the instructions clear? For 3 minutes. They will ask you questions for 3 minutes. Now you question askers, you're likely to run out of questions before 3 minutes are up. When that happens, think about expanding the container or contracting the container to find new questions. Differences that weren't named, to see if you can name new questions. Or what's connected or what's not connected will help you generate questions. Are you ready? Decide who's going to go first. 3 minutes starts. You haven't got another minute to ask questions. ask questions. The listener asks questions and the teller doesn't speak. Ask questions based on what you heard. What can you write What questions can you ask? Another minute, just keep asking questions. So I want to ask those of you who read your 3 sentences, told your story, and listened to the questions, what did you notice about that experience? It's difficult to listen and not answer, isn't it? Yeah. You know what happens when we answer a question? Our old patterns of understanding, our habitual patterns come up, and we reinforce them when we answer. And when you're not allowed to do that, then there's some way in which they loosen a bit as you're listening to the next question. Does that make sense? And as you're asking, especially when someone doesn't know the situation, they ask better questions. I sometimes do this with somebody on a bus. Yeah. The next stop's in 10 minutes. Will you give me 10 minutes? I've got this problem, and I'll read them 3 sentences, and they'll ask me questions. And it's amazing how much that will shift the perspective that I have. Those of you who are asking the questions, what did you notice?
It was difficult.
It sounds like a really simple tool. What was difficult about it?
Not building in one's own assumptions.
Yeah, you need context. I think you need context.
Yeah, we expect to have context, and we expect to be able to do a series of questions. And what does a series of questions do? It puts us into a tighter, more controlled system, right? So that whatever question we ask first and they answer it, the future is written on the stone, right? But if you say, I won't answer, then you keep the degrees of freedom high and the opportunity for exploration and possible discovery large. Does that make sense? So let's switch so the other one has a chance. Now, be sure you only do your 3 sentences. Don't tell them anything else. And then questions. Are you ready? Switch. Go.
Because originally you were framing your like first part is, will it happen when if I predict that it might happen, then you go to
Ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? What about Okay, well, I'll stay in that vein. have some kind of game theory
Is there a way to get more information
tactic
from
crazy that because we're running over an explosion.
Have you spoken to your wife about this? Do you have dogs? Do you like dogs?
So I invite you back again. That's the so what stage. The so what is the opportunity for you to step out of your sets of assumptions to see what else might be an interpretation for a possible path, to explore what else might be exploited, to challenge yourself in ways from another perspective, not to get trapped in theirs, which so often happens, or to get trapped in a dialogue to a conversation, but to be able to open up your own perspective to see that reality in a new and different way. What, so what? And now we're going to go to now what, which is, given the questions that you heard, and the questions that you asked the other person, because those are also very informative, what is one thing that you might be able to do to make a difference in that sticky issue? Not something big, not to solve it. What is your next wise action? What is one thing you can do that will make it different? Because we know we won't be able to solve it. They're not solvable. But what would one next wise action be? I'll give you exactly 30 seconds to think about it. I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it. That would be interesting. Tell each other. Yes, that's it. Share with your partner what's
I mean,
Do you have a next wise action? I sometimes say, do it by Tuesday. Is there something you can do by Tuesday?
which Tuesday?
Which Tuesday, exactly. But to be able to think about what's next. Now, how many of us who are working on massive, intractable problems find ourselves overwhelmed with long-term plans and long-term perspectives that we can think of, but to execute, we know, even before we start, is not going to be possible. And to measure the outcomes is even less likely. Now, I'm not saying don't do that. I think that's also an important thing to do. But unless you are inside the mountain, moving around the ice crystals and running with the little animals inside, unless that's happening, the other thing will not happen. It just won't. And so why not to think about the next wise actions as well as the long-term arcs? Make sense? So that's the practice of HSD. And that's why we can say nothing is intractable, because there's always some next wise action you can do. Even if it is going back to the beginning and picking another path. So sometimes my next wise action is, oh, realize that that was a dead end. Oh, okay, now I realize that my next wise action is to see what other path would have been possible. Does that make sense? It's just always someplace to go. And as researchers, this is what you do. And now you have permission to do it. The other thing that I'd like to do is just to talk a little bit about the discipline of HSD. We talk about patterns and not problems. So a problem is one where the container is small, the differences are few, the exchanges are linear, and so you have an opportunity really to make a difference. So in the Cynefin, these would be simple and complicated. The minute that we say to someone, take your problem and think about it as a pattern which never repeats, is infinitely variable, is happening at multiple scales at the same time. Nobody's ever seen it before. Suddenly, they feel free to be in a very different, innovative, creative space. And so often, the biggest intervention I make with a group or a team that I'm working with is to help them see their problems as patterns, because then a conversation can begin. You'll see, obviously, that the answers to these questions and the characteristics of the pattern are moving toward a higher complex, higher dimensionality system, and just inviting people into that more open space. And you wouldn't be surprised that it gives them hope. It's hard to have hope in a constrained 0 degrees of freedom space. And we talk about that really specifically as a continuum. And so the problem is going to be closed, few, linear, and the pattern's going to be open, many, and nonlinear. And we use this as a tool with clients to say, okay, you've got this problem. Where is it? How big is its container or small? How many differences are you looking at? How are the exchanges right now? Which direction do you want it? That's the what. Which direction do you want it to move? Do you need it to be looser? Do you need it to be tighter? And the now what is, which of those conditions are you going to shift? Conditions for action, that's the practice. I wanted to tell you a little bit about some projects that we've done. I'm just going to do these really quickly. So one of the things that we've seen for sure about complexity is that precision is not the same as accuracy in these systems. And in a complex system, you can get smaller and smaller and smaller units of measure and get farther and farther from an accurate answer. These systems are massively structured and intricately interacting. And if you zoom in, we used to think you got truer. The smaller the unit, the better the measure. Complex systems, that's not true. The smaller the unit, the more likely you are to miss the sweet spot in the system. And we use that when we talked about farming in the Andes. So we've been working with a project called Collaborative Crop Research Program with farmers in the Andes. And about 10 years ago, they started realizing they were farming on a hillside, and they realized that the place that they were farming didn't work, and they needed to move up farther to get a little bit cooler because the mountainside was getting too hot. And then they had to move down a little bit because there was more rain than they had had. And they were adjusting to climate change. And the researchers who were working with them realized that by looking at what they were doing, that there would be a way to think about how that shift might happen. And so they think about the patterns of scaling up from what that place would be. And that the accuracy of that didn't come from Joe moved up, and probably Jose moved up and moved down. That it wasn't about that. Looking at what he was doing was not important, but if we looked at all the farmers on the hillside and what they were doing, and then we looked at all the farmers in Kansas, then we could get a real picture about what was happening. Does that make sense? And so this shift in this assumption. I've often asked myself why it's been so hard for 30 years to get people to think in this way. I've tried really hard. And I think this is one of the assumptions that people make so fundamentally that it's just hard for them to believe that you can get more accuracy by moving farther away and closer to something. The second is that cause is not a vector. People so often think that A goes to B, and when we think about causality, we've got to think about it as a straight line. But in these systems, causality is not a vector, it's a network. They've got causality in many directions, in fact, in many dimensions in many directions, and that causality simply isn't a straight line. And that has helped us think about a theory of change. GPI is the Great Plains Institute, and it's this interesting nonprofit that started about 15 years ago, funding sustainability efforts. And if you could come up with a good idea for a sustainability effort, and you could get it funded, you could come work with them. And so they have got the funniest bucket of stuff under the sun. If you can think of it's being helpful for sustainability, they got it in their portfolio. But now they're needing to build some kind of coherence across it. And so what we've been working with them to do is to try to see what all these different pathways into sustainability, what they will give you in terms of a single theory of change. And it's not a linear theory of change, but it's a networked theory of change. And so we've used this principle within. The third one is that time It's not a line, like at lunch when we were talking about what the future looks like. We're beginning to think about time instead as a manifold. So the past is a manifold spreading out from this moment. You can think about them as crossing lines. Sorry, like this. So the past is a manifold. It includes lots of things in many different places. It draws into this moment where we are, bringing everything that was it. History's not forgotten, all of that, complex system. And then from this moment, a manifold emerges in imagination and possibility and what might be there. And that we're moving that manifold. We're not moving along a line of time. You know why we came up with the timeline, right? Who invented the timeline? Anybody know? Augustine did. He had to explain that the moment of Christ's birth was the beginning of the world. And in order to do that, he had to put time on a line. And we've been living with a timeline ever since, at least in the West. So, the deep learning ecology. I mentioned that a bit before. This is the idea of helping people learn how to use this idea for an ecology of learning. And we had to stop thinking about learning as a sequential process. That no two students learn HSD in the same pathway. That there's an attractor pattern, maybe it's a strange attractor pattern, which is HSD. And students come into it in various places and shine a light in various parts, detail, build up more detail and accessibility in that part or another part. Everybody comes in a different place, but they're all building the same pattern through time. And so one's trip through this dynamical process of change may be the same as or different from others, but none of it is a straight line. It's an iterative, adaptive action process. That's the deep learning ecology. And then the question is, how do we as teachers set conditions for that to happen? And this one is really important, that difference is not a conserved quantity in these systems. It's not a conserved quantity. That you can have difference increasing in the system, all across the system at the same time, or you can have it decreasing across. Increasing a difference here does not mean it's going to decrease there, full stop. And so what that means is that you can think differently about difference. So making a change over there is not a trade-off for a change here. They may be interdependent, but they're not conserved. So it's a biological idea that I can take a plant, and I give the plant to you, and you get more plant. I take a piece of gold, and I give it to you, and I've got less, and you've got more. But that time that these differences are not a conserved quality. And this was one that just happened recently. We were doing a peace and justice issue, looking at resistance to 21st century oppression. Because oppression in the 21st century is different in kind than it was before. We can talk about that another time. But we were working with some folks. There were people from Burundi who were DRC Congo refugees, and there were people in the DRC who were Burundi refugees. And they said it was the funniest thing. These guys were coming this way the same way these guys were coming this way. And some of them were, and they were going home or they were going away, but that the pathway went both directions of this migration. And they wanted to think that these were people from that area who decided that that was the question they wanted to ask. Because the difference of being at home or not being at home, this one being at home or not being at home, there was something about the differences being amplified or transformed that became a new question that they took home with them. About what does that mean if you look not just at a migratory pattern or one group of refugees, but if you look at the whole system and see the ways in which it is balancing or not balancing across the whole picture. So it's a question that they went home with. So that tells you a bit about what's in the work.
Sorry, can I just ask you something quickly?
Oh, sure.
That I find very interesting about the refugees, because what about the children that are born in refugee camps? Because where do they fit in?
Exactly. And that was one of the things that was really interesting, because one of these guys had been born in a refugee camp. And he said he had spent a lot of time knowing that that was his home, but this was that he'd never been to his home. And then when he got to his home, there was another turnover and he had to leave again. And so there's some point at which home just stops being a difference that makes a difference. Being a home, having a home. Then if that doesn't make a difference, what does? Right? And is it relationship? Is it, well, certainly it's safety. So that was the kind of question that they were asking.
It's identity as well, isn't
Yeah. Well, and for so many of us, home is identity. And yet, how do you hold an identity if you don't have a home? Those were all the kinds of questions they were asking each other. So they looked at the containers that were there, they looked at the differences that made a difference to them as refugees, and about the exchanges that they had. And so one of the guys said, well, I wonder what would happen if I just stopped somebody who was going the other way and had a little conversation with them. Wonder what that would mean. I said, I don't know, go ahead, right? So that's an example of the way in which you can use the conditions to generate options for action. Yeah, who's born where is a really good question. And the final one, this idea about things that begin have to end. And I think this is one of the Anthropocene real challenges. In fact, it may be that all 5 of these are Anthropocene challenges. That if we're going to be able to live into this next era, that we have to find some way to come to terms with these characteristics, these fundamental conceptions, I won't call them misconceptions, reconceptions, in order to move forward. But this last one is about recognizing that wherever you are, there was a before, and that the before is still in the present, and there's always an after, and the after is still in the present, and that to think about something starting or ending is just a delusion. Maybe it's a useful delusion, sometimes we need it, but we can't tell ourselves it's true, but that we see ourselves in it. So it gives you a sense of the ways that we use this theory and this practice in the context of praxis together. And now we get to ask, what are your questions? What are your questions? What are your comments? What are your connections? What are your suggestions? Oh, this is resource, but I want to hear what you're thinking. So these are resources that are available that I can talk about in a minute. Yes, ma'am?
Isn't the beginning and anything depending on how you define object or topic or whatever?
Yeah.
I live, I die.
Right, and it may be helpful to think of it that way.
Yeah.
I live, I die, I'm born, I die. Or it may be helpful to think of it as I'm part of the human race and moving forward. May be helpful to think at the end of your life that you're going into hospice and are going to choose a different kind of ending. You may have a religious, there are lots of different levels to do. And the idea is that this work doesn't give you answers. It just gives you more productive questions to ask. So it's really important for me to think about my birth and my death. Like I'm buying life insurance and I want to know when they think I'm going to die. In that question, it's really important.
Yeah, all I'm saying, context is important.
Yes, absolutely.
Some things to begin.
Yeah.
And
And then we can have a conversation about your context and my context and where they fit. Yeah. And it's to ask the question, which is the important one now? This is the place that it gets into the critical systems thinking, critical theory. Good. Yeah. Were you moving toward a question?
No, I was
Yes.
just shuffling.
Just shuffling.
How often do people freak out when they realize about because I'm thinking of existentialism, right, and I'm thinking of this mass freedom and these ginormous open systems that ultimately present you with an intractable question of, what is purpose, what is meaning, whatever the case may be. And obviously lots of people in this room are working on ginormous questions, and you're still doing it, so congratulations. And some of us run away and sort of ostrich our head in the sand. I'm just wondering what your experience is of people when they're confronted with the enormity of the...
So the first time this happened, I was talking about this work really early, and there were about 300 people in the room. I was doing a keynote, and I got to the place where I was talking about the so what and what might shift and that you have all these possibilities. And the room went absolutely quiet in a way that I had never heard a room go quiet before. And I thought, oh, now I'm really in trouble. Didn't know what was going on, but it has continued to happen. And I think that at that moment, when a group recognizes that this really is a different place, that they go a little crazy. You can practically hear their paradigm shift in the room. And I always bring it back to the now what. So you've been out in that space, all that space is true, but it's not useful. What's useful, right? And so it's folding them taking them out into that space and folding them back into this moment of action, taking them out in the space. It's a Baker transform, taking them out of that space and then folding them back in again. And so that they build a resilience, the way a loaf of bread does, build resilience by stretching it out and folding it back.
Because I'm just thinking, you know, I mean, I work with students a lot and we talk about poverty and development and, you know, all the big stuff. And there's a lot of despondency, right? And, you know, they'll point to, well, look how much apathy there is in South African society for certain things because they've realized how large problems are and it's an open-ended system with complex interactions and all the rest of it. So I'm wondering, I mean, obviously the theory is pretty sound, but practically it's quite hard to actually fold people back in because they get scared and sort of...
Yeah, and somehow this statement of, yes, that is true. What you say is true about the strange world and the depth of it and that this ginormous problem exists, that's all true. And you're living in a given context, a given container, a certain set of differences that you can touch, a certain set of exchanges that you have. And so if you take that whole thing, we all know about fractals, if you take that whole thing and you see how that pattern of the ginormous shows up within a container that you can touch, then you could say, okay, now what? I'm going to recycle, or I'm going to compost, or I'm going to whatever. But you never forget that the larger one is there. It's just that you zoom in. And sometimes I might zoom in on my work life, zoom out. Sometimes I might zoom in on something else. But that I find really grounds people. When you take it to action, there's something just really grounding and concrete about, so but now what? In this moment, for you. Because you can't do an adaptive action for somebody else. It's got to be your own. Try it. See how it works. Let me know if it doesn't.
Cool.
Because it pretty consistently does. Oh, yes.
And one of the core focuses at CST is also looking at like socio-ecological systems, and there are people in the room who know a lot more about that than I do. But maybe just a question of how you do this in a way that also takes into consideration ecological and non-human voices and roles and actors.
That's a really good question. Because I think this is all there is, I think an ecology is essentially a container with differences in it and exchanges of various kinds. And so I can cut, and those exist in a way that I can never know them all. But when I come to it as a human being, I have choices to make about which of the maps of that ecology I choose to engage with. So if the map that I choose is the economic value of a rhinoceros horn, that's the difference I see is the one that makes a difference, and that's the container that I'm looking at, then I'm going to behave in a certain way. But if instead I choose another set, then I'm going to behave in a different way. And so then in a socio-ecological system, the job is to be very careful about choosing which of the containers are critical, which are the differences that make a difference, and how to make exchanges. That's the first thing. The second thing is taking some action. Analyzing it is not going to change it. Taking some action. And then learning so that your next picture is better. So when you come back to your next what, you're more well informed about what it is. So that now I'm not a specialist in social ecology, and I don't know whether that fits at all with the discipline. I haven't read in the discipline, so I don't want to. Does that make sense in what you know about the discipline, or is it just off? In La La Land. Did I just go to La La Land? In what way, how is that same as indifferent from the way that you do your practice or hold your theory? Everybody's looking at you, so I am.
What is that? No, I mean, I think I'm digesting it here, but I think, I mean, a lot of, Megan, your question was really good, and I mean, I think a lot of the issues we are grappling with are these big sustainability issues. And so in a sense, it's, you know, you can choose these different perspectives, but maybe in a sense what we're thinking about is, you know, also at a bigger collective societal sense, we have bought into certain kinds of perspectives. And those are having quite big consequences for both for the environment, but also for us. And so, you know, are there some other perspectives that we can bring in or kind of make more mainstream, that would actually fundamentally change the ways that we as bigger societies are interacting with other human beings, but also with the environment, that may lead to better outcomes, or emergent patterns, shall we say.
Yeah.
So
That's a good point. And then for me, the question becomes, how do I keep from getting lost in my own predetermined pattern definition and foisting it on everybody as if it were a solution? Because that's the risk for me, is to see my hammer and everything as nails. And how can I continue to revamp my own map of the territory in a way that continues to emerge, either as I move down in levels or up in levels or from one place to another? How can I continue to be fresh in my own perspective?
Yeah, but I guess it's about also how these things are scaling up from individuals to whole patterns across societies and across the world, and how that's shaping, much bigger scale dynamics and outcomes. And so in a sense that they're not just arbitrary, they're having also real tangible effects, even though these are emergent patterns of many people's individual kind of choices, but which themselves are influenced by the bigger society. And how is there space for changing some of those patterns?
Yeah. So this cross-scale causality is a really significant issue. And I think it's the issue of our time.
Yeah, that's a major issue.
I think that's the major issue.
Yeah.
And the way that the CDE speaks to it is that a difference at one scale becomes a container at the one below. And a container at one scale becomes a difference at the one above. Right? So this gender is a difference here. And if we look at a smaller one where the men were on one side and the women were on the other side, then gender becomes a container. And then within that, there are differences which are also containers. And so patterns then will allow you to have an understanding that goes up and down.
Using your analogy of like the map of the terrain, I guess my comments also about how we don't just see the environment as a context that we help to inform our perspectives, but we're actively, that they are part of the same thing.
We are it.
We're not separate from, so it's also about changing those power dynamics and those, rather than you use the environment to inform our perspective, that they are co-constitutive of one another.
I agree, and I'm sorry if I sounded otherwise. Yeah. Because there's not just the difference between it and it, there's also the difference between me and it.
But we're not just me and it, we're all me's and it's and...
All me's and it's, and if you're going to make a finite system enough to act, you can acknowledge that and say, and in this moment, this is the it and the me that's important. So this is definitely not a constructivist perspective, in case you didn't notice. Because it says, out there, they may all be there, and yet when you zero in, you can take action that really is going to make a difference out there. And it matters what you choose. Yeah. And I think seeing all of us as us and it and they may be the perfectly useful way to see the world. How's it working for us? Here and then there, yeah.
So I'm just curious, I mean, you talk about praxis, and I suppose you are working between kind of theory and then going out there and sort of getting involved in these dynamics systems. How do you see yourself as an agent in these, working in these systems? I mean, what is there a name for someone who's trying to work within a system, trying to unlock, connect, support? I mean, are you that kind of, would you see yourself as that kind of a person? Is it an agent, a convener? What, is there something like that? How do you work when you're working in a system?
So can I talk about that in two levels? One is, the praxis is the way I define the work that I do, but the adaptive action is itself praxis.
Yes.
right?
Okay.
Because it's
I
a
see,
theory
I see,
action
okay.
cycle, so anybody who's doing it is in praxis.
Okay.
So that at that level, and
Okay,
also about
okay.
the work that I do.
Yeah.
The second thing is, I believe everybody is doing it all the time. We just do it better or worse. That a 2-year-old is saying, you know, what am I feeling? So what does it mean? Now what am I going to do? I think all of us, just as conscious human beings, even if we're doing it badly or doing it in a really stupid way, which I sometimes am. So the trick here is not to do it or not to do it, it's to get conscious of it or not be conscious of it.
And can you help, I mean, I'm just thinking about if a system is struggling in some way to grapple with an issue, a contained, defined system of some sort, and it's struggling with a low level of, call it awareness, I mean, is this, and can you intervene in that system, I guess is what I'm asking.
Then I'll answer the professional question.
Yes.
So for a long time we thought we were doing training, teaching them about HSD, and that we were doing consulting, helping them do it. And at one point we realized that our consulting was training,
Okay,
and that our
Okay.
training was consulting.
okay, yeah,
And so we decided we weren't really doing either
Yeah.
of those.
Yeah.
And we talked about, so what are we doing? And we decided what we're doing are adaptive action laboratories.
okay.
And so the way we name what we do is to facilitate adaptive action laboratories.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
And it does make sense, I think, to people, because then we invite people in to bring their real challenges. So while they're learning theory, they're also doing their work. And so we invite them into praxis as part of the contract. So we think of ourselves as facilitators. We're holding conditions for that to happen.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am?
Maybe a totally ridiculous question.
Okay.
So you go into a business or an environment camp, and then you ask the 3 questions and you do a whole process. What happens if something comes up which is you have to like question your ethics, or something comes up that gets exposed, or something that comes up? Am I allowed to leave it on the table because my 3-day workshop's over? What do you do?
Yeah, exactly. We have very few relationships that are just one-shot deals. And it's because once we've done the cycle once, it's really easy for people to want us to come back. But we ran into one such last week. So this is an emergency shelter for children and a place for residential treatment for children with mental health issues. And it's very old, it's been around for a long time. It's in Minnesota, where I live. And they're trying to reframe their practice to make it more reliable and better outcomes and all of those things. And it became really clear to me the first meeting that they had racial tension issues. Became really clear. And so I asked in what way that was a difference that made a difference. Right? I didn't say, is it a difference that makes a difference? I said, in what way does it? And they said, oh yeah, well it doesn't really. And so I've continued to ask that question at each stage of this process. So we've been working together for about 3 months, and I continue to ask that question. And in the middle of a meeting about something else last week, one of the women says, I just can't sit here any longer, there's something I've got to talk about. And it was the race question that came up. And at that point, they knew enough about the dynamics for us to talk about. We now know that we can talk about the way that that difference is a difference that makes a difference. We can harvest the energy at that difference rather than having it underneath. And so we spent the rest of the time talking about, for them, what difference did it really make in the place where they were? How did they see that difference? And then we left with an adaptive action. What can you do now that you've seen this difference in this way? What do we need to do next? And so your question about ethics, if you see something that you wish you didn't see or they're not seeing, what do you do about it? I just continued to ask until the system saw it in itself. But there have been times when I just left a project, when it was really clear that there was an authoritarian malintent, anti-community intent. And I kind of slammed the doors, I walked out, which probably wasn't the best way. But I mean, when I become aware of that I'm being used as a pawn in someone else's pathway, you've all been there, right? Then you just excuse yourself out. But you have to keep asking yourself, is that happening? Is that happening? Because it can be very seductive to have that kind of power. Yes?
I quite like the idea of thinking about a problem as a pattern, but at the same time it's quite overwhelming to open it too wide, and so one way I guess we're dealing with containing things is to think about a desirable future, like when we're talking about sustainability, and that's sort of a container there, but the container itself of that future could be a threat at the same time. So we have been in pathways over the last many years that are not desirable, but keep doing. And an example of that is people have criticized the way we measure progress in the world, that it's not measuring the right things. But it is a container that we're holding because we have the idea that I don't know if the question comes across, but that we're trapped in the future that's the container at the same time, right? Or the future that's defining the container. How do you break out of that? So I know this is kind of a vague question, but
no, it's a lovely question and one we run into all the time, right? So you need to be able to say we're going to have no more than 2 degrees centigrade increase in the temperature of the world. You need to be able to say that.
Right.
That's a concrete, bounded space. That makes it a finite game. You're saying that's the difference we're going to use and talk about. And at the same time, you have to recognize that is not the only or most important difference that makes a difference.
Right.
That we're going to use it for certain kinds of decision making, but there are other differences that make a difference that we have to pay attention to too. So we make those lines because we have to have them to motivate ourselves or to be clear, to have explicit decision making patterns. But we recognize that it isn't a thing in itself. It's a function of, it's useful at that time. It's not true, it's useful. And so then we see when it stops being useful, we shift to something else. Or if it's useful to me but not for you, I don't make you take it. I ask you what's useful to you. Does that make sense? So it just becomes a part of the manifold. It's not that it replaces. This is the thing about differences aren't conserved. Just because the 2 degrees centigrade is different to you doesn't mean that something else can't be different to me.
Right. So I guess the question then is, in some ways we are aware of the traps we're in some cases, but the question of transforming to another thing. So how do you see a different future in a way, and how do you transform? So in using this difference and exchanges and things, sort of butchering the language you use there, but how does that become useful in the process of first looking into a different future and also transforming into that future?
It's a really, really great question, and it's one of the ways I think that the HSD takes a different path into complexity than some people do. So we do not believe in a teleology. We don't believe that having an end in mind is the way to get there. That there isn't an end, there's no there. That's part of nothing has an end. That there's no there. So why do you have a vision? Because the way that you move in that direction is whatever tension there is in this moment. And that the way you move is whatever the tension is in this moment that's moving you directionally toward where you're going. And the reason you have a vision is to tell you which tensions to pay attention to here. Does that make sense? So the purpose of the vision is to inspire this moment. It isn't to represent the future. And if you have a vision that isn't informing this moment, it is not a good vision. Right? And so how do you go about finding a definition of sustainability that is that focuses on the right pattern, the right container and differences and exchanges, that's going to be motivating and inspiring and enlivening in this moment? And there won't be just one. There'll be one in this community, there'll be one in urban, there'll be a different one in rural, there'll be a different one someplace else. And are they somehow connected to the same one? And so you have to constantly stay in inquiry about what is my vision, what is your vision, how can we name that vision in a way that's going to move us directionally in the right direction. Yeah, there are some complexity circles that at about this point, I'd be getting tomatoes thrown at me. Because there are some people who believe and work in complexity, especially once you've taken it into the human systems, have ended up with a teleological thing going on. But we don't think so. We think the change is from the potential in the tension in this moment. And you had your hand up a minute ago and I missed you.
Matt?
Matt? You had your hand up a minute ago and I missed you.
So I might have just had an aha moment.
Thanks for this. It's been really stimulating. I'm interested in terms of education and what the way you're suggesting solving patterns. I won't call them problems. How young do you think we could introduce this way of thinking about problems to learners? And could you see? I mean, I see parallels with other different types of education systems, but it's like, could you see this being used as a way to educate? And do you think it's applicable that we train teachers to model problems and how you go about learning in this way? And if you do, or do you know of any examples where that's been happening?
We have one wonderful associate who's a kindergarten teacher, and she taught her kindergartners adaptive action, and they started teaching each other to read. She also taught them simple rules. And for those of you who know about simple rules, we think about them very differently than some people do. But it taught them, her little kindergartners, simple rules. And they were managing their own behaviors and other behaviors. And their parents would come in and say, our dinner conversations have shifted because John comes home and follows those rules at home and we're having dinner conversations. So yes, it works. And it's not all that different from Freire's, so it may not be all that new. But we have done work. One of the things that makes it most important in education is that most education reform theory looks at the institutional level and the power structures and the money in the institutional. But we know that where education happens is in the classroom with the one teacher in the one place. We know that's true. Teachers know that's true. But before, there was no theory base that brought them together. And so in the first course that we taught, applying this to education, we had people from school boards, teachers, superintendents, parents, all different levels and all different ages of people. And the board member said to me, if you can ever come up with a way to let teachers and board members think about learning in the same way, the problem will be solved. And I said, well, adaptive action is it. And 2 days later, she said, the problem is solved. How can we get this word out? Because a teacher sees it, the board is making decisions using adaptive action, the parents are using it, the children are using it with each other. That a system where everyone is doing adaptive action consciously is a learning, generative space to be. Now, you can ask the question about why we have not been able to get that word out into the education community in the US, and I have lots of reasons. Many of them begin with the letter G for Gates, but it's such a different picture, but yeah, we believe it could transform education. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, this has been wonderful. Because, no, really, we're in desperate need of a language with which to talk about and tackle wicked problems. And you've so very obviously come up with a language, a way of starting to engage and interact with really complex problems. So the question is, and you alluded to it quite early on when you said, you know, you have a business, a banking CEO or something. How do you deal with people, and often they sort of very powerful vested interest people who are completely locked into you know, the static and the linear and the rational and the and sometimes either really don't get it or don't want to get it. How do you deal with those, and how much time does it take to get them to
Right, it's another really good question.
grasp the language?
So we don't give up right away.
Okay.
So the first thing we try, so recognizing that it's only a tension within themselves that's going to shift the system. It's either a tension in that person that's going to move them forward, or tension in the organization for which they're responsible, or the family or something. And so we begin to look for what are those places. What are the differences that make a difference to her? And so I'll say things like, what keeps you awake at night? And she'll tell me what keeps her awake at night, which begins to tell me what are the differences that make a difference to her that we might be able to address. In the same way that I ask, what's your sticky issue? And so I don't talk about the theory with her, and I don't talk about, we just talk about her issue. And when her issue is fixed, or if she realizes that she's not going to fix it, but she's going to take the next wise action, then the conversation continues, and she then begins to build her capacity as an adaptive action person, doing it consciously, and then it spreads. If I can't find something in them personally, or if they're not willing to open in that way, I look at the executive team. Because I never saw an executive team that didn't have problems. And I say, so what's the tension in your circle of people who work with you, your direct reports? Is there anything there that's really giving you trouble? And is there something we can do in that container to look for a difference that makes a difference, build exchanges that are different to help you work together better as a team? And if they say no to that question, then I usually say, call me back in 5 years. Because often what happens when we propose to an organization and they take a more traditional, like strategic planning process or team building process or whatever, and sometimes some unpredictable point in the future, they realize that that path simply isn't going to take them anyplace. And maybe they remember us and they call us back in. But we like to say our clients are the desperate ones, the ones who tried everything else, and then they're willing to sometimes step across. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
But if I talk to them and they seem like everything's just fine, they're just as happy as they can be, and perfect. I gave a presentation once to a bunch of young entrepreneurs, technical entrepreneurs. They were all guys without socks. It was really great. And they didn't have sticky issues. They didn't have any problems. There was nothing that they couldn't solve. And they thought this stuff was just crazy. Because we just buzz through it. If I have a problem, I just solve it. No big deal. Nothing is whatever. And I just said, oh, well, thank you very much. I'll give you your money back and I'll go home. But sometime when you realize that you're not all powerful, give me a call. They didn't call.
Glenda, maybe just one last question. We'll have to start thinking about the wine and snacks at this moment.
Oh, definitely.
And then we can continue the conversation, but it will be downstairs in the where they will serve the wine and snacks. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I was wondering about an instance where things were so entrenched that it didn't work out. Did you come across the situations where people were too deep in their containers?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There have been lots of them. I mean, there was one time when the CEO got up in the middle of a strategic planning session and said, I think we're done. And I said, but we're supposed to go till 4 o'clock. He said, no, we have many important things to do. And he dismissed everybody and sent us out. That was the worst. But often what happens is that people come and it sounds really great and they think they want to make a change, but they do their first adaptive action cycle and they get to the now what? And it's something they can't do or won't do. Or they end up doing the same thing again and coming back again. But one time in particular case, this was with the government, and it was a county-wide HIV/AIDS initiative, and a statewide initiative, and a city initiative, all of which had different ideas, long histories of lots of conflict, people moving back and forth among them, lots of interpersonal relationships that I was not privy to until after the fact. But we have a conflict resolution process that they invited us to come in and do. And it went great. It was a perfect day. Everybody liked it. They had a great time. They were able to see. It asked people to distinguish their stories from reality, and they did that. Had lots of breakthroughs and clear things and everything. 3 weeks later, they were right back to where they were. Because that system didn't have enough tension yet to move. Now what I hope is that our intervention was one of the things that was helping build tension in the system, and that at some point it might move, but not under our watch.
Right.
So I hold that hope that even when the outcomes aren't obvious here, and hoping that I've shifted the conditions in the system enough that it's made it readier for the next one, wherever that might be. Love that question. Others? Is that time?
Yeah.
Is that time? Thank you all very much.